Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Africa Gas Forum, which is a side event alongside the main annual African Energy Indaba. As delegates, you will already be familiar with probably with the conference and with all the details and the program. This is the 6th Africa Gas Forum being held alongside the Energy Indaba. So we'd like to welcome you to our session today. Hydrogen gas as a green or energy alternative. Does South Africa have a right to win? There's been a lot of focus on South Africa's competitive advantage in this important and fast-growing trend in the energy space and energy transition. So we're going to be looking at some of the issues and on this topic. And for that purpose, we have 4 great speakers. I will introduce them as we go along. If you would like to ask any questions as we go, please put your questions in the chat box. And we will answer those after the session. So just as by way of background, the energy transition is very much on everybody's lips at the moment in that industry. It's in full swing in developed countries, and governments and industry are under a lot of pressure to move to a greener energy alternative globally and probably in Africa, but to a lesser extent, possibly at this stage. And hydrogen is one of the areas that is a big topic of discussion. But the real question is, where does Africa stand in this transition? We have many of the resources needed for this to take place effectively, but South Africa, particularly, is well placed to revolutionize its own economy, and also with the spillover effect and benefit of other African countries in supplying green hydrogen, and possibly even as a global leader in this space. But how do we leverage this opportunity in the continent and in this country, in South Africa? And what are the challenges? Are global trends going to leave us behind? Are we looking possibly at an energy divide if we don't come to the party fast enough and exploit these opportunities? We'd also looking at issues of policy. What do governments need to do with policy and regulation, not just to keep up, but to position African countries as leaders in this energy transition? So these are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at today. So once again, welcome everybody. And so I'm going to move to our first speaker. You will see the CVs of all the speakers in the pack. The conference pack on the event, the online information. So I'm not going to go into the details of each of them, and you can look that up in your own time. But so I'm going to start with Dr. Romain Debar, the Managing Director of the Kearney Energy Transition Institute. The organization provides leading insights on global trends in energy transition and technologies, as well as the strategic implications for private sector businesses and public sector institutions. So Romain, I just wanted to talk to you about could you just talk a little bit to us about the emerging hydrogen economy, some of the innovations that are coming out of that space, and where we can expect this to go in the next couple of years? You know, how far are we? Is there space for Africa?
Thank you, Diane, for this introduction. Well, first of all, I think hydrogen has never been or never had such a strong momentum. If you look at, what are the strategies of governments or countries or regions at the moment, just the European Union has committed to produce 17 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. China, is going to lead, or is willing to lead the green hydrogen technologies, and you have Southeast Asia and Australia willing to build large import-exports value chain in these regions. So when you see this strong objective or strong ambitions in various regions, you see that you also have strong policies and regulation being implemented. It's just the beginning. What we can say is that this let's say low carbon hydrogen economy is really nascent. Of course, there is already a hydrogen market, but it's what we call the brown market, which emits carbon CO2 into the atmosphere. So we are thinking about decarbonizing sectors with low carbon hydrogen, either blue or green. So produced from the electrolysis of water, or produced from steam methane reforming and combined with CCUS. So what we can see then in this market, even though there is a strong momentum, there is a lack of supply and demand for this new hydrogen economy. So there is, of course, a market for the hydrogen consumption today, and for refining in particular, for steel production, and for ammonia production in particular. But there is no real significant market at the moment for the new low carbon hydrogen. Of course, there is multiple of possible applications, and that's where technology innovation is going to accelerate in various regions of the world. It's a very nascent, a very complex value chain. You can look at different type of production of hydrogen, but also there will be probably a full midstream economy developed around hydrogen. By midstream economy, I mean ways to store, convert, and distribute hydrogen. And also you're going to have potentially a full set of new end users like mobility, power generation, power storage, and so on. So it's a nascent economy. There is a lot of innovation. I think it's also supported by the fact that very recently a lot of regions across the globe has committed to carbon neutrality. Europe wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. The US are back to the COP21 agreement. China has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. So there is a lot of commitment, for carbon neutrality, and hydrogen has a role to play in that, in this objective, because low carbon hydrogen can help decarbonize almost 2/3 of the CO2 emissions across the globe. So in multiple sectors. It's a nascent value chain, so we'll see, and there is a lot. We'll see how this is going to evolve. There is a lot of uncertainties also around the economics of the blue and green hydrogen in particular. The cost of electricity represents 2/3 of the cost of the hydrogen per kilo. So this is the way you will access, low cost electricity will be a key competitive advantage. And for Africa or South Africa, where you have a huge potential in renewable energy and renewable electricity in particular, this could be a very good competitive advantage for South Africa to develop this hydrogen economy. Maybe to conclude on that, I think what is going to be important in developing, the hydrogen economy is to make sure that you balance the production of hydrogen with the demand of hydrogen, making sure that every kilogram of hydrogen that you produce is going to find an off-taker, if you want, or a consumer. So developing two aspects at the same time, making sure that the infrastructure also developed at the right pace. And also what is going to be very important is to make sure that the hydrogen you produce is effectively low carbon. So which means that in terms of blue or green hydrogen, it means that the electricity, the carbon content of the electricity you use to produce the hydrogen is low carbon. So you shouldn't use coal or any kind of fossil fuel to produce green hydrogen, because in that case it's not a green hydrogen anymore. So this, cost-benefit analysis, both economics and environmental, is very important. And we should not forget as well that so hydrogen could be a good decarbonization solutions for some applications, but we should not forget that you also have alternative solutions. Just an example for mobility, many people are talking about or thinking about the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, but in some cases, battery electric vehicles are also alternatives that could be interesting to compare. I leave the floor here to other people if you want, and I'm happy to answer your questions as well.
All right. You talked about it being a nascent industry, and the costs are still quite high. Are some of these targets for talking about like Germany and other countries putting in place these targets, are they too ambitious, or do you think this will move quite quickly and costs will come down quite quickly once the market starts building? How do you see this developing in the next, say, 10 years?
Well, it's a little bit like what we experienced for solar and wind. Probably at the beginning, these technologies were very expensive. And we know with the effect of scale and industrialization of these solutions, and the cost went down, and it's still going down. So we expect that for hydrogen, the effect of scales and the improvement of technologies could improve. Maybe not at the same pace as solar and wind did, but I would say that in the end, if the first priority is not is really to mitigate climate change. Hydrogen is really needed to decarbonize some of the sectors, in particular those that are very hard to abate. And in that case, it will be a bit more expensive than today, meaning that the energy is going to weigh a little bit more than in our shoulders than it is today. But that's something that we cannot avoid, I would say.
Sure. Okay. So we're in it now, so we'll see how that develops. So I want to move on to Christoph Reinmitz, who's the chair of LPG at the Power Working Group. He has long experience with global energy players, including GE and APR Energy, and he is currently working as an independent consultant in the energy transition space. So Christoph, let's move a little bit more specifically into Africa as a whole. Where is Africa in this picture? You know, South Africa, there is talk of hydrogen developments in South Africa, but I'm not sure. I mean, perhaps there are other developments in other parts of Africa. But if we don't move quickly enough, is there a danger of an energy divide between Africa and developed regions? They are surging ahead in the transition. Is there a possibility at some point we'll be left behind in terms of trade and being able to access, international business if we are not keeping up with this energy transition? So what is our competitive advantage, and where should policymakers be focusing their attention?
Diana, thank you very much for the introduction. And I think Romain did a very nice job in teeing up sort of the topic here. So I'd like to unpack your question a little bit and says, take it one by one here. Where does Africa sit in this picture? And I think Africa is unlikely to be a leader. As we heard from Romain, there is a huge amount of investment going into hydrogen, and I would argue there's a bit of a hype going on as it relates to hydrogen. And lots of funds are being allocated to the development of hydrogen. I think what we know today are some of the benefits and some of the downsides of it. And I think this needs to play out over the next few years. So I think Africa at the moment sits comfortably, doesn't need to take a leading role. I wouldn't suggest putting in a huge amount of funds. Having said that, the next question is, are there green shoots? And as we heard, we're really looking here at green hydrogen, i.e. the carbon emission-free hydrogen, and that will come from renewables. And I think here is one of the big advantages that South Africa has to play. Vast space, lots of sunshine, and also probably the best experience, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, when it comes to solar capacity. I did a little bit of digging, and South Africa today has 2.9 gigawatts of installed capacity coming from solar, and there is about 6.8 gigawatts in the pipeline. Now that can be grown exponentially over the next few years, and I think that is a great opportunity, and that's where South Africa clearly has its strength. A word of caution, though, I think if we want to have government involved, there needs to be a clear decision where to deploy this hydrogen. Is it primarily for industrial use? Is it for power generation, for transportation or household? I think that's one of the key questions, and those are questions that the Europeans are grappling with. So if we go and look at what the Europeans are doing, they're primarily looking at industrial use. The Americans are looking at decentralized power primarily today and use in materials handling, which is forklift trucks. So very specific niches. And I think in Africa, that is an important question. And if we follow the original source of energy, i.e. solar, then that's where your production is going to be of hydrogen. And then the question is, what role and what industries or what uses come with that? So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. You asked about the energy divide. I don't think necessarily there is going to be an energy divide between those who are well advanced in hydrogen and those who are not. I think because of the opportunity that presents itself, creating lots of solar generated power, there's a huge a chance for South Africa to play a role here, potentially to offer itself as part of a lab, and to explore with companies, other governments, and use South Africa as sort of a launch pad for hydrogen. The key element here is driving the cost, the leverage cost of electricity downwards, and getting sort of to a cost of €1.50 or $1.60, 65 per kilogram. And we're far from that today. So before we really have broad commercial use, the costs have to come down. So the competitive advantage that South Africa has, other than the sunshine, I think it's got a robust legal environment, as can be seen for power generation. I think that's something South Africa should leverage, and it's got attractive labor costs. Again, something, if you want to bring in industry into the country, that's something you can go out as a business development group and advocate, soliciting other companies to come to South Africa for that purpose. And lastly, you asked about the government. Where should they be focusing on? Well, I think what is important is clear regulatory principles from the outset. It's important that investors know there's certainty around it. They should be at the forefront, setting standards and regulations, working with Europe, North America, the US, in setting these standards to be in line, so investors are familiar with what they're getting themselves into. And I think a particular concern I would have as it pertains to South Africa is making sure there is as little red tape as possible. We've seen that in other situations. Red tape often gets into the way of great ideas in South Africa. Keep it bureaucracy light if that's somehow possible. So those are kind of my unpacking of your lengthier question, and I hope that gives food for thought. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. Yeah, I think this issue of red tape is a big one. A lot of private sector players have wanted to move more aggressively into the space and have been held up sometimes for years in South Africa, particularly the mines who are quite forward thinking in this carbon space. So yeah, that is definitely something to talk about. So I'm going to move on to Jonathan. Jonathan Metcalf, who's the head of hydrogen for Africa South Market for PwC. He heads up the hydrogen business unit for PwC in the Africa South Market. Sorry, I'm putting it a different way. Jonathan, what are your views? I mean, we've just spoken a little bit about how Africa stacks up. It seems that in the hydrogen space, I don't think there is very much going on outside South Africa. But how do you see the transition playing out in general terms in Africa? It's moving fairly slowly, I think, at this stage, but and you know, is there really any realistic expectation of a hydrogen economy in Africa anytime soon, certainly without South Africa as a player? What are your views on this? Are we playing catch up? Can we leapfrog in this transition? We have the potential, but is it likely to happen? What are your views?
Thanks very much, Diane. I think it's quite common to sort of downplay South Africa and always say we're behind the curve with regards to technological developments, specifically in the space of hydrogen. But I think it's worthwhile recognizing that we've been reasonably progressive in certain areas in the hydrogen space. Hydrogen Society Hydrogen South Africa HISA is now going into its 13th year. And has been working, quite extensively on R&D around platinum fuel cell development as well as hydrogen storage. By a factor that we sit with, the majority of the world's PGM resources, our PGM players have actually been quite pioneering in the hydrogen space. We already this year we have Anglo American piloting their first heavy haulage mining truck on their mine in Limpopo, which will be a world first for on-site generation and utilization of hydrogen. So I think when you look at some of the developments that have happened on the private sector side, governmental side, and I know my colleague also on the call from the CSIR, in collaboration with the DSI, are currently working a lot on developing hydrogen thought leadership and strategy for the country. It's worthwhile saying that I think certainly in Africa, I'd say we're one of the more advanced economies when it comes to our thinking around hydrogen. But that being said, I think where we are behind the curve is actually our national policy with regards to hydrogen. And one of the key things is that, as Christophe and Romain really highlighted, was the complexity of this value chain. And going forward, it's very unlikely there's going to be one country that's going to own the value chain in its entirety. The players will generally fall across brackets of being either producers, utilizers of hydrogen, or technology players. And our role is really understanding how we're going to play in the market. And it's not necessarily leapfrogging, it's integrating. It's understanding that a lot of the more progressive decarbonization and economies of the Northern Hemisphere have set these very lofty targets for decarbonization and are going to require vast volumes of hydrogen and hydrogen-enabled derivatives to achieve this. And it's how do we integrate with that? Not leapfrog. That would be my sort of viewpoint on that. And especially with the huge volumes they're talking about, Port of Rotterdam saying they want 20 million tons of hydrogen by 2050, Japan, I think it's 10 million tons by 2030, et cetera, et cetera. There is plenty of space to develop the supply chain without needing to compete globally. We have the ability to get billion-dollar projects off the ground. Will only be supplying small percentages of those lofty targets. So I think there's an opportunity to work to work across the value chain. Sorry, it's late in the afternoon. But I think important that understanding that is the model of how we're going to play in the hydrogen economy, then we need to narrow down where we're going to play. We talked about this competitive advantage, and I think, looking at that in a bit more detail, we know sort of generically we talk about high quality wind resource, high quality solar resource, but it's more than that. It's to say that we have one of the best solar resources in the world, second only maybe to Namibia and Chile. We have extremely good pockets of onshore wind, but incredibly good offshore wind almost along the entire length of our coastline. And the important thing when it comes to that first mover advantage for producing cheap hydrogen, this sub $2 scenario that Christophe has talked about, is that we have both solar and wind sitting on top of each other. So our ability to co-locate production, and not only that, to have production vectors that negatively correlate. So we have generally very, very good solar, upwards of 23% capacity factor during the day, and yet in the evening we have wind that picks up and blows through the night. So the ability to have renewables, but that can create a smooth energy supply into an electrolysis process will mean that we really do stand with top quality competitive advantage in the space. So I think, recognizing that that's where our advantage sits as Southern Africa, I'll say, because it extends up into Namibia as well. Understanding how far down that value chain we move domestically is quite important here. And as a function of who's driven hydrogen historically in the country, which has been the PGM players, I think it's important that we don't get too narrow focused in looking at the utilization of hydrogen as it pertains to the platinum sector. Because as we all know, there are much broader usages. And if you even look at the net zero scenarios for the big industrial users globally, sort of by 2040, 2050, the markets within aviation and shipping are going to massively outweigh the amount of hydrogen that would need to go into transport or fuel cell vehicles. So I think as Africa, we need to understand that how we're going to play is through integrating with other people's strategies, but where we're going to play is not necessarily going to be focused on just our commodities and, for want of a better word, beneficiation for beneficiation's sake. We need to look at what do our off-takers want and what is our pure competitive advantage, which is the production side, not necessarily the downstream utilization and beneficiation of commodities. So I think understanding those boxes of how to play and where to play will be very critical going forward.
In terms of integration, you talked about aviation and shipping. I mean, these are two areas in which Africa is very much connected with the rest of the world. I mean, would those be a place for South Africa to look at starting? I mean, if ships and planes are coming in from elsewhere, they're going to need to have that facility wherever they go, or is that not how it works? Or is that something we should be looking at as a first phase?
Something we should be looking at. Whether or not that is first phase all depends on a various degree of factors. First of which is what we should really be concentrating on is, at commercial scale, how cheaply can we land a kilo of hydrogen? That's the first discussion point. And then it's to say, looking at the downstream technology usages, each one has a different parity point. Some are much closer to parity now. If we look at the production of ammonia and methanol, for instance, these are much closer to parity than, for instance, using hydrogen and green steel. So there's varying schools of thought on at which point synthetic kerosene produced with green hydrogen will become on parity in the aviation industry, but it's probably not likely to be the very first mover. If you look at the global projects around synthetic kerosene, they're still in their early stages. However, if you look at marine fuel, which we're looking at the production of green ammonia, this is something that is much, much closer to parity. So, and already there are big pilot projects in Europe focused around repurposing of shipping diesel engines to run on green ammonia with zero emissions. So definitely an area that we should be looking at, but the key priority is prove to the market that we can produce hydrogen very cheaply and let the market off-takers dictate what we produce.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. I'm going to move on to our fourth speaker, and the last in this kind of round of questions, if you like. Thomas Roos, who's a senior researcher at South Africa's Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. He's with the Energy Centre at the CSIR. Thomas, you've been involved in a lot of strategy roadmap developments for South Africa in the energy field. Where do you see the big opportunities for South Africa in this space going forward?
I'd like to acknowledge the previous speakers and the comments they've made, because they are very valid. And there is a narrative that can be weaved right through them. I think one of the strongest points that can be made is that hydrogen is emerging for different reasons than were emerging previously. We are seeing significant drive simultaneously for climate reasons and policy targets that have been set by a number of jurisdictions, European Union, Japan, these have been mentioned. Now, Germany in their national hydrogen strategy states that they will be importing in the order of 3 million tons of hydrogen per year from 2040 onwards. Japan, 300,000 tons from 2030 onwards. And they will want Japan will want their hydrogen to be carbon free by 2040. So you have these markets for green hydrogen emerging. So the issue here is not, can we make it parity cost with fossil, but can we make it cheaper than other countries making green hydrogen? So we're comparing apples with apples. South Africa, we're a middle income country, but we don't have middle income skills. We export a great deal of raw commodities. In many areas, we are outcompeted by other market sectors, but our renewable resource is such that we can make renewable electricity cheaper than most other jurisdictions. This means that our number of competitors is much fewer. We're looking at Chile, Argentina, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Australia. That's quite an attractive list compared to every other economic endeavor that South Africa finds itself in. Now, Germany, in their quest to develop a hydrogen supply chain in order to meet their decarbonization agenda, will be unable to generate the majority of their hydrogen inside their country. They can produce maybe 420 kilotons a year. They'll be securing some of that hydrogen from the EU and some of it from partner countries with whom they have a developmental relationship, where those partner countries are good renewable resource. South Africa meets all those criteria. If South Africa doesn't step up to the plate soon, we'll be overtaken by Morocco, Chile, and the others, and we'll be left behind. There is no other opportunity. So the core opportunity here is for us to export essentially solar and wind as molecules. We've done economic modeling at CSIR of hydrogen production. We can deliver hydrogen to Japan at $3 per kilogram before their 2040 deadline. So we know we fit in relatively well in the economic framework. The economic map produced by the International Energy Agency in their report to the G20 in Tokyo in 2019 shows South Africa to be very competitively placed. That the modeling that went into generating that map was very similar to the modeling that we did at CSR. So there is overlap, and we agree with those results. But to show that we can develop is not going to have as much meaning until we actually do. So I would agree with Jonathan to go and say that our vast opportunity is to export our solar and wind electrical capability through conversion into hydrogen for these large markets that are developing. To give an idea of the size of the sector, we have a 40 to 50 gigawatt electrical grid. If we were to capture 5% of the relative ammonia and other related markets, as has been calculated by Enatrag, it would require 300 gigawatts of solar installation and a further 300 gigawatts of wind installation, which means that the electrical infrastructure required for the hydrogen exports will completely dwarf the existing grid. This will reshape the South African internal economy. To do this, we have a few regulatory problems that we need to cross. The IRP is simply not geared for purchasing these levels, these volumes of renewable electricity for a single off-taker, which would be the electrolyzer plant. Some of it will be generated very close to on-site, some of it will be wheeled through the grid, and this looks like an own-use type scenario. So if we can move on that regulatory environment, we can see significant investment. I understand your questions about what can we do in hydrogen in our local economies. And those are good. We can decarbonize significant fractions of our economy, but we need to do our own investment. If we export hydrogen to meet the European and the Japanese goals, that means that on the strength of an offtake agreement, that funding can be raised on the markets. It means that funding does not need to come from the fiscus, and the fiscus is fairly constrained as it is. Now you can imagine with this level of investment in renewable infrastructure, that has huge impact on job creation, value chains downstream, and that is just renewable electricity. We're not even beginning to talk about hydrogen. If we're producing hydrogen in large volumes, we're producing ammonia in large volumes, that which is required by the country is a small offtake. And it is a happy circumstance. It is a byproduct, in fact, for local consumption as a result of this investment. But that will only come if we get our regulatory environment right. It's a very exciting opportunity.
You talk about the regulatory environment, and of course that's critical. I mean, we've seen how much that has really hindered the proper development of independent power producers and the rollout of renewables, etc. So, you know, what is the thinking? I don't know if you party to the thinking in government energy circles on all of these kind of opportunities. I mean, it appears to be, you know, a concern about losing jobs in fossil fuels rather than creating jobs in new fields. I mean, what is the thinking in the kind of official circles about all of this, or is it not really happening at that level just yet?
I cannot claim to have deep inside information, but we do get clues that come every now and again. We know that the presidency takes hydrogen very seriously, and we know that they can see the opportunity emerging. The Department of Science and Innovation, as mentioned by other speakers, has invested in hydrogen for more than a decade. And Minister Nzimande introduced a webinar hosted by EE Publishers and by the European Union delegation, looking at the opportunities of hydrogen. So you do see insights into what can be done. The difficulty really is in understanding how different this new opportunity is to that which went before. In the South African electrical environment, the difficulty is that IPPs are seen by a number of sectors as directly threatening the coal livelihoods. And that is a reality. Yes, it is true that there's a climate argument and there's a strong climate argument and all those things. There's also an economic component. How do you handle that? When you're coming to the export of hydrogen, the coal environment is irrelevant because fossil electricity would not qualify for the European markets. So therefore, if we create renewable infrastructure to generate the hydrogen, it doesn't directly threaten those coal jobs. What threatens the coal jobs is the renewable investments done as a result of the IRP. And that is inherently a consultative process open to multiple stakeholders, which all parties then can be part of. So I think what we need to frame very carefully is to go and state that the investment and the growth in export hydrogen to meet these emerging markets in Europe and in Japan does not threaten conventional jobs. In fact, it creates a whole lot new jobs, admittedly in different areas, in different spaces, with different technologies. But it is something we need to aggressively engage with. If we look at the coal market, 50% of our export coal goes to a single customer, and that's India. Indian representatives have stated in public fora in South Africa that government policy in India is to become self-sufficient in coal. So that export market is going away, and in a post-Paris agreement, it's not going to be replaced. The only opportunity to really do that displacement and to maintain the possibility of balance of payments is to look at alternative markets. And where we really shine in terms of international competitive advantage is the renewable endowment we have. There's no high voltage DC line to Europe. We cannot export the electrons. But if we convert the electrons into molecules, we can export those to those markets that want them. The trick is to do it before our competitors do. That's the opportunity.
I think that one of our, certainly in the renewable space, I don't know if they would be called competitors, but certainly the North African countries, Morocco and Egypt particularly, are very far ahead in terms of the solar. And they're very, very, the governments are very proactive in driving all of this, the renewable energy, so that potentially in Africa that they could be competitors, or I guess, work with South Africa in this whole story. So that I just want to get now onto the next kind of round of questions. And Romain, I'm going to go back to you. Just in terms of policy and regulation, as I think Thomas has clearly articulated, we can't move forward unless the government is kind of moving forward, even though there are pockets of things happening in the private sector. And you mentioned, somebody mentioned the Anglo-American mine story, which is really interesting. But nevertheless, at some point, the government is very much involved in this. So I wanted to ask you, what is the sort of best practice? What are you aware of in these countries that are moving forward very quickly in Europe, etc.? What can they offer us in terms of examples of what should be done in moving this forward in the regulatory and policy space?
The speeches and the key messages are very inspiring. So it's very interesting to understand, the huge potential of hydrogen in South Africa. Still, I think there are some risks, on the demand side. Even if Germany and Japan are willing to import a lot of hydrogen in the coming years, you still need to create a market for the consumption, which is not there yet. So that's why probably we need some policies and regulation, or the government should put that in place, to help this development of infrastructures, but also demand and so on. And one key policy, in fact, in that space, to compensate for the extra cost of hydrogen solutions is the carbon pricing. So carbon price, has been put in place in different areas with different mechanisms. So in Europe, you have the your EU ETS, so emission trading scheme system, which is a kind of carbon market on CO2 emissions. The scope of this carbon market is relatively limited today, just 11,000 large emitters of plants are concerned, and also aviation. So I think at the European Union, people are thinking about enlarging the scope, so extending the scope to other sectors like mobility, for example, and smaller, buildings eventually, possibly, I don't know. So this is one option, and that would be ideal, let's say, to put on the same level playing field, the decarbonization solutions, not only hydrogen, but also other solutions that you can have to decarbonize some hard-to-abate sectors. And then you also have direct incentive mechanism. People are thinking about, the feed-in tariffs, for example, or contract for difference for hydrogen. It's not yet in place. It's just under discussion, and we'll see how this evolves. But what we see, the strategies of the different governments are a bit different. So France, for example, is willing to support the development of the industry itself. So providing, some incentives or some support for, key players to develop their assets and develop their economies, rather than, subsidizing the cost or the kilogram of hydrogen like we did for wind and solar in the past. Research and development, of course, is going to be important, and I think that's a clear trend in across Europe. All the countries have agreed to support the development of some new technologies, in particular for aviation and shipping, probably. So I would say it's just the beginning. There is a lot of tools that countries are thinking about at the moment. Personally, I think that carbon pricing is a good one, and then because it's already there, so you can really accelerate the development of this carbon pricing at the beginning, and it's let's say homogeneous across sectors and applications. And then we'll see what government will decide to put in place for direct incentive mechanism for hydrogen. So.
Yeah, what we want to avoid in Africa is any kind of subsidies. I think it's been a real killer for investment in power, the number of subsidies across the continent. But incentives, certainly, I think that would be a way to go. Christophe, what do you think about this? What policy, what regulation should optimally we be looking at in South Africa in this particular space?
Well, my view is maybe a little bit contrary to what Thomas has been saying. He's been advocating the export of the molecule. I think leveraging the resources that South Africa has and trying to bring manufacturing companies into the country would create a ton of new jobs potentially. Now, there's the issue of geography, but what you want to do is ideally, from what we know today, is using hydrogen where you produce it. The closer you produce it to the point of production, or you use it to the point of production, the more cost efficient it's going to be. And there is potentially a way of creating green jobs in South Africa. And that is, I think, an area that needs to be exploited, particularly given what we've heard from all the participants today, the fortunate position in which South Africa finds itself geographically. And I think just using the solar power, and I think solar plays a bigger role, but we can argue that offline than offshore wind, because the LCOE, the leverage cost of electricity there, is still a little higher than it is for PV. I think there is a significant opportunity, and that needs to be explored. And I think you can start with a small nucleus and develop that further and expand it. That would be my suggestion, would be my recommendation. And I think there is a significant opportunity here, which could also help solve some of the conundrum that South Africa is facing when it comes to weaning itself off of the coal.
Yeah, I think we're probably a little way from there still, but certainly we've got to start somewhere on this journey. Yeah. Jonathan, you talk to, I presume you're in touch with industry in South Africa? What do they feel are industries? I mean, we've got the mining sector is quite thinking quite far ahead, but what about industry in general? You know, are captains of industry looking at these issues quite seriously? Production of hydrogen, and even developing, just generally making the transition more quickly. And how do they feel? I mean, are they being held back by South Africa's regulation and its policies in this regard?
Yeah, so I think it's something that, particularly off the back of announcements such as the Anglo-American mining announcement, as we heard, I think the industries are starting to really accelerate with exploring how hydrogen is going to play an important role in the energy mix. I mean, I think everyone was well along their way of planning the energy transition, even within the South African context. Unfortunately, a lot of these private sector companies' hands were being forced by the accelerating increases in electricity, and it killing our industrial competitiveness. So they were already looking at renewable energy, but I think really in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, hydrogen has started sort of coming on the radar of these industrial players is far more meaningfully. And as we've mentioned, the mining sector really is the first mover in the Southern African space. And there's a couple of reasons why they sit as the first movers. We've talked about the PGM players wanting to stimulate a new demand vector for platinum, as we see the global drop-off in diesel vehicle sales. But also, from a regulatory point of view, on-site generation for own use, in the case of like an Anglo-American, where they're building their own solar plant, electrolysis and storage, and refueling their own vehicles and utilizing the hydrogen on site, is a regulatory much simpler thing to currently get off the ground versus, for instance, energy for export industry. So I think the industrial players at the moment are, particularly in the mining sector, very focused on almost like this scope 1 for hydrogen, of how can hydrogen help us decarbonize our business. And I think this links back to something I'd said previously around, we need to make sure that when we think about the opportunities for South Africa or Southern Africa, we don't think too narrow. And you know, Thomas has very eloquently highlighted the opportunity for a much bigger export play here, whether it be hydrogen in a carrier such as ammonia and methanol, or whether it be the downstream production of greener products, green steel, green manganese, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to make sure that we keep that bigger picture thinking, and make sure that when we look at the policy side of things, we need to make sure we can unlock the export industry, not just create the hospitable environment for own use of hydrogen. And within that space, you know, we unfortunately are still a little bit behind the curve on creating the right environment. I think a lot of the points have already been discussed as to what will really start stimulating these large-scale investments. And as Thomas rightly said, we can't look to the fiscus to get these things off the ground. It needs to be the international community needs to invest in Africa to get these commercial projects going. And one of the sort of simplest problems that we don't have is we don't have a governmental champion for hydrogen. If you look at the German market, which we know is one of the most progressive, they have a federal commissioner for green hydrogen, not just hydrogen, green hydrogen. We don't have an equivalent sitting in South Africa, and until we have that champion who will sponsor and expedite these projects and give the assurance to the investment community that South Africa is a good place to be, not just from a competitive advantage, but also from a policy and regulatory perspective, we're not going to see these projects move.
I think, you know, being part of global value chains raises a whole lot of questions about the South African business environment, whether it be, you know, labor strikes or the cost of exports and things like that. I mean, there's I think a bigger picture with the whole business environment in South Africa to make us cost competitive. I don't know. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I mean that issue of cost competitiveness in industry is a complicated one, and it's, I think it links quite nicely back to something Christoph was saying about this balance between, do we look for the opportunities in hydrogen to just produce and export clean energy in a molecular form, or do we look to try and downstream beneficiate? And the downstream beneficiation can tie into a lot of existing industries. And in actual fact, when you look at how some of the biggest oil and gas majors have started evolving their portfolios. They've started to look for hydrogen investments that can tie into their existing operations, and help start greening those assets and elongating the life of those assets. Now, for them to do that, to make those decisions and start being those first movers in the space, they're only going to do those kind of solutions on industrial facilities that sit in the lower end of the cost curve. Because if I'm going to try and elongate the life of the asset, I want it to be the best performing asset already, and make sure that it's going to have the longest life of lifespan. And the problem is, when we look to the industrial processing picture in South Africa, we still generally sit on the higher end of the cost curve. And it's one of the problems that, if we're looking to take hydrogen and also transform our industry, which is a hell of a complicated animal to start addressing, are we sitting in the right position to begin with to play in that space? And that's kind of going to be up for debate. Whereas if we look at just pure competitive advantage, and we've talked about this, I think at length already, it sits in those first steps of the value chain. And I think that we must concentrate on getting those steps right first, then look to how we can transform the downstream industries from it.
Sure. Okay, great. Thanks. Thomas, you've been involved, as I mentioned earlier, in strategy roadmap developments for South Africa in the energy field. Where do you see the challenges? What kind of challenges have you experienced in previous projects that you've worked in and rollouts of developments in the space? And what can we learn from the past in terms of moving into this new transition? Where have we failed in rolling out national energy strategies? What have the main challenges been? And how do we address those in moving into this new transition going forward?
That's a difficult question. Generally, South Africa is pretty good at plans. It's implementation where we struggle a bit, and there are multiple reasons for that. I think often what is difficult is that you have multiple conflicting requirements. When different parties require very different outcomes in order to succeed, you have a measure of paralysis. And it's when you get a measure of consensus that most parties can win that things move quickly. And I suppose that's the essence of politics. Politics is the art of the possible, what you can get away with. It is in this area that I think is what makes us excited about hydrogen, because the export of green hydrogen does not leave you with any South African constituency worse off. There are no losers. Politically, this is very important in a highly contested space, and energy is highly contested in South Africa. There are many vested interests, and vested interests are not necessarily bad. You are committed, you are passionate, you are vested, you're engaged. But it may be that certain movements work to your disadvantage, and therefore you don't get movement. With the export of hydrogen, that's one of those rare areas where it's good for everybody. If we can produce hydrogen at scale, a number of things happen. We offset the declining coal market. We strengthen the South African grid because we need to evacuate the electrons from where they are generated and move them to where they are required. Traditionally, support and maintenance of the grid is funded by tariffs on existing consumers. Here you're creating whole new consumers, orders of magnitude larger in consumption than that which exists before. You allow for the possibility of new industries. I agree with Christoph. It doesn't sound like I do, but I do, in the sense that it's not an either or necessarily. You do want to have the development of industry. You do want the downstream chains, but the investment won't come there. The investment will come in the export market because there is a strategic advantage in the short term. And that then allows you to develop all those other aspects. You mentioned the threat that Morocco presents to South African interests. Yes, that's true. They're a lot closer to Europe, which means they can export their hydrogen in a pipeline. and mix it with natural gas. That's a low-cost way of moving hydrogen. So for us to export raw hydrogen is probably not our best move. But exporting ammonia, exporting methanol, as mentioned by Jonathan, are particularly interesting. Ammonia, because it's a highly traded global commodity as it is, it's transported in LPG tankers. And there are a number of ammonia import and export terminals in Europe. Methanol is interesting for a number of strange reasons. It is much simpler to make than other hydrocarbons in the Fischer-Tropsch process, where you have a whole range of products and you need to find markets for each of them. When you make methanol in direct methanol synthesis, it's highly selective and produces 99% methanol. Methanol doesn't have to be the final product. It is a great transitional product. You use it as input in refining for producing a whole bunch of downstream products, including plastics. And in the future, the manufacturing of plastics and the manufacturing of aviation fuel are probably going to be the only legitimate hydrocarbons in a post-Paris world. So there are a whole lot of opportunities. I think I've drifted a bit from your original question, but
that's okay.
The important point that I want to make is it's horses for courses and understanding where you play. We won't be exporting pure hydrogen, either as cryogenic liquid hydrogen, or maybe even in liquid organic hydrogen carrier, perhaps. But we might be exporting it as methanol and as ammonia for beneficiation elsewhere. Whereas we may find Morocco prefers to concentrate on gaseous hydrogen. This will all come out as all the different countries work out in the mix. We may find the hydrogen market being similar to the oil market, where your marginal cost of production differs everywhere, but the market settles on the spot price. If you can produce cheaper than others, then you have an advantage. If you move there, you can create your downstream industries. If you don't produce downstream industries, well, then you're stuck. Then you're back to Dutch disease. And that's a problem.
Yeah. So, okay, I think we've got literally sort of 5 minutes to go. I wondered if there's something, that burning issue that we've missed in the questions that anybody would like to raise in these last couple of minutes. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground, but, you are the expert. So is there something you feel, Christoph, anything that you would like to raise as a last point?
I don't think there's anything to add other than we need to remind ourselves we're at the very beginning, I think, of the hydrogen journey here. And we need to be also reminding ourselves that there are others who are spending a huge amount of money at the moment or over the next few years in developing this industry. So I think my recommendation for South Africa is, how do I sail best in the wake of this development? How do I benefit from what others are doing? How can I partner without having to cough up the tremendous funds that are required to develop this?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Romain, how about you? Last comment.
Yeah, I think for me, bringing an energy transition perspective here, I think ideally, what is important is to find the best pathway toward decarbonization. So which means optimizing the energy efficiency, minimizing the energy cost for the populations, and also ensuring the energy security for the countries and so on. So in the end, the most important objective is mitigating climate change. So I'm sure hydrogen has an important role to play there, but we should carefully think about what are the key applications where we cannot cover everything with hydrogen. So we need to find what are the best applications and how to use it best. And lastly, I think optimizing the use of renewable electricity is also an important question. Is it for hydrogen or is it for something else or both? So I think it's a very important question to ask.
Okay, great. Jonathan, last word to you.
Sure, thanks. I think from my side, one of the key messages I wanted to close with was I think everyone will be quite familiar with the 4 pillars of the hydrogen economy in terms of its downstream usage, whether or not it's transportation industry, building heat and power, the energy sector, energy balancing, or industrial heat and feedstock. And I think traditionally as a country, if we look just at South Africa, we've been very focused within a subset of the transport sector, which has been the use of platinum as fuel cells and how hydrogen will benefit the platinum sector. And I think as a leaving comment, as a country, we need to make sure we take the step back and look at the larger opportunity. And from a pure risk point of view, I think it was Christoph mentioned that there are competing industries, or it was Roman, sorry. Battery electric vehicles directly compete in some instances with fuel cell electric vehicles. And if Elon Musk develops a battery that is 100 times lighter than he currently has, it could kill the fuel cell market. So from a country, we need to make sure that we don't put all our eggs in one basket. We need to invest across multiple different hydrogen end usages and make sure we're not too focused within the PGM sector.
I think that's a great point, with all the disruption that's going on, even disruption is being disrupted. So I guess it's something to bear in mind. Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you all. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. And Thomas, I did give you quite a long time to talk, so it's not like I'm preventing you from having the last word, but you made some really excellent points, all of you. I think it's been a extremely valuable discussion. So we look forward to the questions for people watching this. Please don't forget to put your questions on chat box. I think there's a lot of issues that still need to be explored in this, which we can't cover in 1 hour. So we look forward to that, and we will get the experts to answer those for you. So I just want to say thank you very much again to the speakers for excellent and very original input. I think these are a lot of debates that we're not really having here, I think, enough. And also to the Africa Energy Indaba organizing team for putting together this fantastic event year after year, of which this gas forum is a parallel event, as I mentioned at the beginning. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody, and I think we'll close it off there. Thanks everybody.